If I had to pick out 3 themes from your talk that really stuck out to me, I'd say first is getting feedback continuously from users, iterating on it, adapting on it. Second, which you didn't state outright, but I think was a theme through everything, was not prematurely optimizing. Right? The docs, the product, the protocol, even the way you engage with users, everything. Always desperately trying to avoid premature optimization, wasting resources. And third, cultivating a community very carefully, right? And thinking really, really thoughtfully about what is actually the set of people. So to that end, how do you, let's just start with feedback. You specifically talked about stated versus revealed preferences. Can you think of a time or give an example of how to get a little bit past the stated preference? Like some time that someone gave you feedback that you heard was interesting, there's clearly something there, except you needed to do a little bit more work to figure out what they really meant, beyond what they were explicitly saying.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of like you have to do it a lot, like in terms of you have to be constantly talking to people and actually getting a bunch of these canned responses or these polite responses to start to detect like, okay, this is weird that like everyone has this piece of feedback and it's not that particularly useful.
Yeah.
So you can like on a tactical level just vary the way you're asking those questions. And so the example I gave before is someone's like, oh, I'm too busy. Sorry, I'm too busy to use Farcaster. It's like, well, you're not too busy to use Twitter. And so you can have that in a combative way, which then you're probably not going to get an answer from the person because they're like, well, screw you. Like, why do I have to tell you anything? Versus even just framing the question a little bit more leading at the front. Right. It's like, hey, notice you were active on Farcaster for a little bit, and you haven't been as active recently, but I see that you're still active on Twitter. Is there anything specifically we could be doing better? Right, so it's almost like you acknowledge that like there's a humility, and I actually find that people then they kind of realize like you're in a mood to hear actually the brutally honest feedback.
It sounds like you're setting the stage emotionally.
Right, because if you just kind of ask in like in almost like a blunt way, someone's like, oh well, if I tell the person what I actually think, then they're going to argue with me. And it's like, well, why am I even? I don't want to argue with you. Like, have them be like, oh, this is better. Like, and I think I definitely have days where I just find it really frustrating. Like, I have my normal account, and then I just have like an alt account that I followed like 200 people in crypto Twitter. Like, these are like people that I'm like, okay, I want to have these people on Farcaster every day. Like that's Sonic success. And these people are like talking about all this stuff in Ethereum and decentralization and all this, and I'm just every time if I kind of catch myself at a low point, I'm just like, you're so full of shit. You're like just doing this on Twitter, and like you actually aren't like doing it on the decentralized, whether it's Farcaster or Lens or pick your favorite thing. And then you get a little less emotionally driven on that, and then you kind of step back and say, well, it's like, well, who gives a shit? Like you have to figure out like to build something compelling enough that they actually want to go switch. So you can either get mad at the people for not doing like what they should be doing, or you can just deal with the revealed preference of like your shit isn't good enough yet. So like you gotta make that better, and so that's actually tends to be more productive to get back to like work.
Yeah. So those 200 people, how do you select those people? And also more broadly, I think everybody who's used Farcaster agrees it has a specific style, specific community style, specific community ethos. I think is really cool. You immediately get the vibe, right?
Yeah.
How do you curate that set? How do you identify that set? Who are the best users to target first? Like how's your thinking evolved in that community cultivation?
So it's a little bit of a convoluted process in that I usually start with my main account because I'm doing the DMs anyways. And anytime I see someone post something that I genuinely think is like, okay, they put a lot of thought into that. It's not just like some shit post that's trying to get engagement or like whatever, where it's the person who's doing that kind of like Etherscan sleuthing, or they're trying to like kind of construct some attempt at like maybe here's a better way to understand this part of the world. I like go to the other browser tab and then I add that person. So it's not like I went out and tried to find Twitter in a way. It's slowly over time, just because I was already using it.
Sure.
But what's nice is that account now, the algo, it's really good in terms of like if you actually are careful about who you add in there,
Right.
Then the algo is like actually like, okay, I don't have to add any sports. There's no distractions in that account. Right? I have no one talking about Ukraine in that account. It's like purely like people talking about whatever the current thing in crypto is.
Totally. It sounds like a algorithmic vampire attack.
Yeah, sort of. And so, but that's actually my baseline. Is I check that feed every day, and then I compare it to Farcaster, and I say, like, where is the diff here? And it's frustrating because it's like we have a lot of work to do because there's a lot of good stuff that people are putting on Twitter.
Right.
And these are people, I mean, like they're interested in Ethereum, so like we should be able to offer something, you know, for them, and we just haven't hit that level yet.
And how much of that is the dev targeting strategy? Because I think something I personally really like about the Farcaster community is how builder dev focused they are. Does it come purely from that, or are there other specific things?
Yeah, I think so. That wasn't the original thing, and actually going back to one of the questions about like the NFTs, the other thing that the people who stuck around tended to be people building companies. And so what I founded, especially in crypto, and it almost became like the people who are willing to use a network when you're talking about like tens of DAO, it was almost like group therapy, like in the sense that like you get to talk about like being a founder and working through this.
Right.
And actually, if you just look at the people who are most followed on the network, like I want to say 80% of them are, you know, founder of a company, most of them in crypto. And so that I think contributed to the early vibe. And then I started to actually lean into explicitly. I'd like tweet and be like, if you send me your GitHub as like the way to like kind of evaluate someone. But I think that the other just like tactical aspect of focusing on devs as we shifted towards that as a kind of a discovery is it set the network up to actually have a bunch of people who, as soon as it got to be big enough, like they started tinkering around.
Very serendipitous. The right crowd is already.
Yeah. So if like you're trying to build a protocol, best group of people to have interested in it are people who can code.
No question.
You know, GPT might solve that for everybody, but like I think for the time being, like you know, a public GitHub profile that has some activity is usually probably a pretty good proxy.
They're related. Yeah. Relatedly, how do you think about the risk of crowding out developers? Right. The hope is that there will be many clients, many applications, many interconnections between different types of services that read and write from Farcaster. Of course, you guys started off with the Warpcast client. It's still the leading client. How do you establish the type of credibility to let real serious builders know, like, this is neutral territory, you know, this is fertile ground for you to build on? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so one, we're figuring this out. Like, don't have any experience doing it outside of just intuition and kind of the experience over the last couple of years. I've been a big fan of the Apple ecosystem for a long time. So there's a term in the Apple ecosystem called Sherlocking. This is back when Finder didn't exist on Mac OS, and there was an app called Sherlock. It was like a way to find your files. And every year at WWDC for the last 10 years, like some developer, because Apple added some new feature to the OS at the OS level, like got Sherlocked in the sense that like they used to have an independent business. Now this is being given away for free. Simple example of this is there was a flashlight app business that existed for the first few years of the app, and then eventually it just got added to the phone, right? So like overnight, there are no, maybe you have super flashlight. I don't even know if it's an app anymore. But I think it's a balance, and the way we think about it is like, so first, we can do a lot of like talking. I can do this, I can go on podcasts, we can put developer docs or whatever, but it's like show, don't tell. Like, so in terms of like, it's actually the actions that you take are going to build the trust with developers. And then I think we realized, especially kind of second half of last year, as people started to build and like you had the Discovs of the world start to show up, that, okay, actually now is the time to, going back to the stat, don't optimize too early.
Right.
We are actually behind now. Like very quickly, it was like, oh, we need to actually get the network to credible neutrality faster than maybe we were originally planning. So it's like a good problem to have, but like there's a lot of work between now and then, right? It's like hubs need to ship, we need to be on Ethereum mainnet, and then permissionless signups. And so there's a lot of work between now and then to do that. But I think that's where, one, it's helpful if your product is literally a public social network so you can communicate with people. But going back to that tactic I mentioned about Telegram, so we had an app Telegram to start. And what we actually did early on was we created an invite-only dev chat. And I would post on Farcaster or even Twitter sometimes, and I'd say, if you're a developer on Farcaster, DM me. So it's like a pretty niche audience. But that channel now has, I don't know, 300 or 400 people. But it was pretty small for a long time.
Right.
And the other thing, no offense to VCs, I didn't allow any VCs to come in because I didn't want the dev chat to be like someone's alpha of like, ooh, let me ping this person and like see if they're raising.
Totally.
And so actually that sub community, so we just had two Telegram channels. We had the like bug report, like whole Telegram channel, and then this dev chat. And that's actually where we started to build the trust and make mistakes and have people feel like it was actually a smaller venue, even though they could have been doing this on Farcaster, where they can tell us like, hey, I think that was like not a good decision, or like, you know, that didn't work. And then once that chat kind of started, and I give Varun credit, he really nailed the sequencing on this. Once it got to about 100 people, he started doing a bi-weekly dev call. And his whole deal was, I'm going to put out the agenda the night before, and I'm going to cancel the meeting if there's nothing on the agenda and no one has added anything to the agenda, and then keeping it really, really short and efficient. And I think that also started to build a group of people. And now I think about 30 people, and people have like full-time jobs, they're doing other things, but they attend the dev call because now they feel bought into this
cool.
inner sanctum of the community. So it was like a community within a community that you're actually building.
That's super interesting. Have you thought much at all about how these developers and later clients will monetize? Do you have a theory there? And it's obviously there's some important prerequisites.
So we are planning to do subscriptions. We're going to try that because I think if you think about Farcaster, that on-chain element in some ways is like a domain. Like you need almost like a registrar who can like manage that for you. And I have this belief that like if you can just get Apple Pay in front of people, having been at Coinbase and know like what the drop off on like fiat rails and all that kind of stuff is like, basically if the sign up experience for Farcaster is you open up the app, you sign up for a subscription, we do a meta transaction behind the scenes on chain to register you, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
You get two things out of that. One, I think just even having subscription, like the low effort trolls just never show up. Bots don't show up at some amount of scale. Like I'm a big believer in a lot of what Elon is doing with Twitter. Like if you ask me, it's like, what is the biggest pain in the ass thing to like growing Farcaster? It's like Elon's running Twitter. And I know a lot of people think he's like running it into the ground, but like the guy can land 2 rockets at the same time on ground. I think he's going to be able to figure out, like having run a version of Twitter, albeit much smaller, like not rocket science. So I think that the idea of subscriptions as a increasing baseline quality is something that I'm excited about. That said, I think the revealed preference at scale on the internet is people like free.
Yep.
And so I think that maybe at some point, you know, Spotify actually is a good example, and Netflix is basically getting there too, where you have the ad-supported tier and the premium tier. And I think that like the way I want to do it is build the premium tier first, and then add a free tier at some amount of scale later. But I think I don't know. I think it worked pretty well for like, you know, Netflix and Spotify is like, and I think if Twitter could go back to the beginning, assuming you had like Stripe and the internet infrastructure that you have now, Apple Pay, I think Twitter as a subscription product from the beginning would have actually been an amazing business, assuming you don't hire 8,000 people. Like,
that's right.
And so I'm actually relatively bullish on what Elon is doing there, and I think we can actually apply that to decentralized social, at least in our client. And I think one thing people forget is like Elon has already built a subscription business that's like a $1.5 billion run rate in Starlink. That will probably be a $10 billion business in the next 18 months. And so it's like he actually understands subscriptions. And so I think consumers like subscriptions, assuming they get like a better user experience.
Yeah, there's so little game film on subscription social, right? But
yes,
there's still a lot of interesting countercutting evidence that suggests certain things are broken. There should be certain experiments. Proof of personhood is definitely one of the most interesting angles for it. I think maybe in the early days of social networks, when they were still growing and you needed the initial user base, the initial value proposition, it was a little harder. But now we've reached a special critical mass where we can try to experiment with different ways to isolate to interesting groups.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is like, you have an American college degree, call it about $200,000 worth of education expense.
Yeah.
That's its own social network. And if you just amortize that over the entire course of your adult life, probably something like $8 a month. So like I do think people like have these things. They're slightly priced differently.
Yep.
And so I think it all comes down to the user experience, and it's like, is this worth it? And I think people showed that like as soon as Netflix showed up, it's like, why would I ever watch television where I'm watching a 30-minute show, 23 minutes, and then I have to watch 7 minutes of like pill ads and car ads. Like people just don't want that at a certain level. Yeah. And so I think that consumers are primed for this, and it's just like it all comes down to execution.
That's super interesting. Changing gears a little bit, since you didn't come from a social network background, how did sufficiently decentralized develop? Like, what was the thought process to where you isolated, platform risk and the minimal components of protocols that need to be put into the neutral layer to make them credible building foundation?
Yeah, so I thought I basically really enjoyed Ben Thompson's aggregation theory during the 2010s and reading Stratechery as a blog. It's like I didn't go to business school. Like I worked at companies and then kind of read stuff on the internet. Peter Thiel, Chris Dixon, Paul Graham. And so you kind of take all that stuff and just think about like how did people build successful products and kind of all those frameworks together. And then just for me, I'm like an infovore. So I've been using Twitter as like a power user for 15 plus years. RSS is still used. And so the original idea for Farcaster was kind of like, could you make RSS competitive with Twitter, right? And the kind of, I think approach from a social standpoint was you have to get to kind of some shelling point of like an identity space. Right. That was one of the core things that I think Twitter beat RSS. Like the reality is domains are not user friendly.
Yeah.
Like we use email today.
DNS domains.
Yeah, DNS domains. Like we use email despite the fact like that they should have never been exposed to normal people. And the counter to like, yeah, we use email. I actually think the only reason we still use email today is because it's a function of work. Whereas I actually think like if companies didn't use email, consumers definitely wouldn't use email. It would all be like WhatsApp, phone number, Instagram, like username. And so I think if you're thinking about social, like the world has moved to this, like you're represented by a name.
Right. So the theory there is that the most valuable network effects are accumulating to different parts of the system.
Yes.
And if the network effects, maybe one of the most valuable ones, maybe the most valuable one, I think we're going to learn that, is to the names.
Yes.
And so if you dislocate that and put that into the neutral layer, then that's enough that the system will remain decentralized.
Yeah, and I think that we went with that hypothesis in V1, and then what we realized is, so first of all, people like upgrading their usernames. So on Twitter, you can upgrade your username. If you tie your entire identity to a single username and a user-controlled network, you're not going to be able to update the follows if you change that. So
right.
V2, we have a dual-part identity system. So we have an FID, which is an integer. So I am number 3. Varun is number 2. And so it just increments each time someone signs up. Yep. And then the F name, the username, that's the human readable layer that sits on top. That's optional. And in theory, like, because I actually very much believe in like you should be driving things based on their value, not rent extraction in protocol world. An F name could be interchangeable with ENS. Like you could use ENS or build a client that just respects ENS. And the beauty is everything that lives at the hub level doesn't need a name. Right. It's on an FID. So we felt like that was more intellectually honest. That was a mistake we had made in the original protocol.
I think that's right. I totally agree.
And so we're bullish on like Farcaster F names just because people are who spend a lot of time in the ecosystem are going to have a better name there, and so they're going to ascribe more value to that. That said, I think what we realized is like, and this crystallized, it's always controversial because triggering for people, is when Trump got kicked off Twitter, it like was so clear to me what the sufficiently decentralized social network should be, right? Doesn't care about his old tweets, doesn't care about his likes, doesn't care about his DMs. The only thing he cared about being kicked off Twitter, and this is anyone with a large audience getting kicked off, that's why probably Elon bought Twitter, he didn't want to lose his big audience, is you have a public pointer on Twitter, your username, that 80, 100 million people have opted into getting an update from. And then you, from your phone, can just, boom, hit 100 million people. It's an insanely powerful, like if you were to just go back to show like kings and emperors throughout history, it's like, yeah, I have this little device that I can just like beam a thought to 100 million people instantly, like
Totally.
that's a lot of power. And so our point of view is, if you look at email as a contrast, you don't hit that scale with email in terms of, I don't know what the biggest email newsletter is, but it's probably not.
It's not billions.
Yeah. But with email, if I'm using Substack as my newsletter, right, and I have a custom domain on it, and Substack decides they don't want to work with me or I don't want to work with Substack, I can move to MailChimp or my own server, and I can continue to email all those people. And like that for us was like, okay,
Yep.
how do you actually take Twitter and move it to that level of decentralization when the reality is no one wants to run their own server? And so like you view running your own server as even more decentralized. That was the moment we like kind of like, we're like, okay, this is the level of decentralization we really need to focus on. And this is the layer that we actually need to get out of the hands of any individual company or country.
So you let people own the thing that the network effect accumulates to. And then these other components, which are incredibly important, obviously, the server, where's the data stored, the schema, the model, those things are really important, need to be built for the application to work. But as long as those things all ultimately serve the controller of the username, then maybe that's decentralized enough.
Yeah, and I think that like the other thing you have to just, from a first principle standpoint, is so Farcaster hubs, there's a consensus algorithm, right? So it's starting to sound like a blockchain. It's like you got a dedicated server, you have a consensus algorithm, but first principles, there is no double spend problem with social. There's a double spend problem with identity. That's the thing that lives on a blockchain. But if you think about social, if I type hello world twice, 2 different messages, that doesn't cause a catastrophic loss of faith in the value of the underlying currency. Whereas if you obviously spend an Ethereum transaction or a Bitcoin transaction twice, everyone is impacted by that. And so like not needing that level of, Byzantine fault tolerance or like, allowed us to use CRDTs and build a consensus algorithm. So hubs are very fast. They don't have any cost effectively relative to like an on-chain cost. But we realize that like identity collisions, double spends are very like expensive for the network because they do lose faith in the network and therefore the network effect. So that's why we opted to put it on chain even though there's cost.
Yep, makes sense. How do you think about authenticity and projecting authenticity? It was something you mentioned in your talk, going from fake BS, shill, that's an uncomfortable behavior for a lot of people.
Yep.
Certainly is for me. But on the other hand, very true that people like updates. People like to be in the loop. People like to take a little bit of ownership of the thing, know about it, be a part of it. That's a very authentic behavior. What does that mean specifically? Like, and even for the founders in this room, right? How can they be both pushing the project, inviting people to participate with them, encouraging their people they work with to take ownership, but in an authentic way?
Yeah. So it goes back to the dog fooding to the brush test point. I don't even know what it is now, but I think it's like I'm double-digit percentages of like all activity ever on the Farcaster network, and it's not me like writing scripts to do that. Like
sure.
When I'm doing GM and welcome, that's literally me typing like GM and welcome to like the people who are joining the network or like responding on the Twitter. And so I think there's a bit of proof of work component to that. Of if people feel like you're trying to like scale your time and get leverage, like people are really sophisticated, and they're gonna quickly see that. Whereas if you're willing to kind of like put the work in and pay attention to feedback, respond to people, the stuff that they don't see publicly helps build that brand. And then I think publicly, the other thing is like, you all know when someone has an update that they're not overly marketing or they're not adding a bunch of like, syntactic sugar around that like talking about the protocol. It's like trying to keep things narrow to a milestone or a screenshot.
Yeah, like a LinkedIn post vibe versus a
right.
maybe.
And so I think the simplest thing is just like keep the post short and just like and show not tell, like in the sense that like anytime you have a screenshot, anytime you have a link, like always more interesting for people. Like people aren't on Twitter to like basically have a LinkedIn post, but they're on Twitter because they want to discover something interesting. So when something is actually interesting happening in your protocol, try to just let the interesting thing do the work rather than putting a bunch of additional shilling on top of it.
That's great. So some of the founders here are less technical. I'm personally very generous with how I think about technical, right? Like just because someone's not a software engineer day to day doesn't mean they aren't a technical mind. I know your co-founder Varun is deep in the weeds. How do you advise to founders who are a little bit less technical or who are focusing on the non-technical components to get familiar and eloquent enough and deep enough into things so that they can be competent in a space like crypto that's incredibly technical, not just in a strategic way, but even like you were talking about, ECDSA curves earlier today. Like what's the right framework for a founder in that position?
Yeah, so I feel pretty passionate about this. I was an English major, so like if I can talk about ECDSA curves, I can promise you can get up the curve on that. But I think it goes back to authenticity. It's like if you're interested in this stuff, like
it's hard not to get sucked in.
Yeah, and it won't feel like work. If you're not interested in it, then that's a little harder because then it'll like basically feel like work or homework, and you kind of don't want to do it. That said, like, can I explain to you like all of the nuances of the EVM or no? And like even when I was at Coinbase, like Bitcoin UTXOs still hurt my head, like trying to think about that.
Yep.
That said, I think just trying to surround yourself with other people who are really passionate about this stuff and then just kind of let them talk or ask them questions. Like the beauty of crypto people, like if you kind of can surround yourself a little bit with them, and they can also be like over Telegram or whatever, is they love to just like talk about crypto like forever. And I think that they get a bad rap like generally as a group because there's just like the people who want to talk about like price and whatever token versus the people who literally could just talk about the technology like forever.
Totally.
And just listen to those people. I remember just at the Coinbase lunch table when I first joined in 2014. I don't know if you guys know who Olaf is. He's a bit of a character, but he was one of the first employees at Coinbase, and he was talking about Ethereum 2015 at Coinbase, and like if you just pay attention to like what other smart people are doing, like by osmosis you're going to be picking that stuff up. I mean that like Ethereum was not consensus in 2015, so I think
True.
I think you just have to have an open mind and an ability to listen, and sometimes the interface of the person that you're talking to might not be like the most polished, but the content might be great, and so that would be my recommendation. The other thing is like there's an infinite amount of content on the internet, and maybe use ChatGPT now to summarize it for you, but I don't know.
It's easier than ever to climb up the hill, really.
Yeah, I generally find YouTube is really good if you can kind of find the right things. I will plug the Canon reading list from A16Z.
It's very good.
I have a competing reading list, which I think is also really good. So if you type Dan Romero crypto reading list, it's I think there are no, but yeah.
That's great. Any parting words for the founders in here? I know everybody's been really appreciative of your time, so thank you, Dan.
Yeah, look, I feel a little weird because it's like Farcaster has a really long way to go, but I did have a good run at Coinbase, and the thing I'd say is like crypto's pretty brutal in terms of the ups and downs, and it's interesting that this market is actually timed with like the first down market for tech generally. Like it was always really weird at Coinbase, especially in the first crypto winter, where basically mid 2010s in San Francisco, it's like everything's up and to the right,
Totally.
and like crypto is just sideways. And it was like 2 years of basically being like, oh, you still work at a Bitcoin company? I thought Bitcoin died or like whatever.
Yeah.
And then it's a very weird thing to have like stuck that out. And there are moments I almost left Coinbase in 2016, but like 2017 was like a fever dream because all of a sudden like we didn't do anything differently. The just market shifted. And then crypto, it was just like every single person, all they wanted to do was talk about crypto. And it's like, you work at Coinbase? Like, whereas a year before, it would have been like, what's that? Versus, and so I think it's not to say that like, oh, just wait for the market to correct. But what I would say is with crypto especially, like it just by virtue of the financialization of the category, like just the highs are higher and the lows are lower. And so equanimity and a little bit of stoicism, and I think this is what Brian Armstrong's superpower is, and why Coinbase has been as successful as it is like, you got into it for a reason. You have a vision for what you actually want to build. There are so many different temptations on like getting distracted and not actually going ahead and just keep building on that. And so, and I think I was mentioning to you before, is like time preference is a superpower in crypto, in that if you are really excited about what you're building and you can actually, keep burn low, don't get distracted, just keep trying to make week over week progress, get the feedback from the limited number of users you have, like that cockroach mentality, that is, I think, it's way harder to do than, for me to say. But like having seen it at Coinbase, like that's like the guiding light for us when we're working on Farcaster. Like we've raised a bunch of money. We're a 10-person team. We're holding at 10. Like it's like the goal is like keep making progress every week. And at some point we might find product market fit, and it might have nothing to do with actually the market changing.
Totally.
And at that point, then I think you can accelerate it.
Crypto has a really intense financial cycle, right? All products and technology has product development cycles, financial cycles. That's true universally.
Yes.
But in crypto, the financial cycle is over the top because these are assets that can be freely traded.
Yeah.
And that's super weird.
Yeah, it was like, so I went through the first cycle, and then 2017, it was just an insane year. It's like 100x growth in like every metric, going from 10 million in revenue to $1 billion in revenue. And it was just like, so we go and hire all these executives in 2018. Then the market corrects. And all these people who are supposed to be like the people I'm supposed to be learning from like, they're just like freaking out. They're like, what? Like, I've never been at a company that's like just had a 90% correction in revenue in a year. And all of the board members / people who had been there are just like, oh, well, it's not as bad as the last correction.
Yeah, I know.
And so I think it's like, so that was the point where I realized like, oh, the superpower in crypto is you have to be able to tune out the noise.
Yep.
It's like the crypto Twitter haters, like, Web3 is going great, BS, like your friends giving you a hard time. Like those are all the things that are going to distract you away from what you're actually focusing on.
Yep.
So can you describe for us how you think about the competitive landscape for Farcaster, and then what, if any, advantages you think you might have to creating a sustainable social network?
Yeah, so the competition's Twitter. Like, I don't think about any decentralized social networks as competition. Like, all of the highest status people, the people that everyone wants to pay attention to, the current thing, the thing, like when there's a big news event, you're on Twitter, right? Like FTX blows up, you're on Twitter. Like SVB blows up, you're on Twitter. Too much stuff blowing up that are financial institutions, but like just like anything that's happening, you're on Twitter. You're not on those other networks. And so that's the hard thing, is like, how do you chip away at that? And so our approach is actually to just go narrow. And we're specifically focused on Ethereum, because I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in crypto, but having been in it for 10 years, I think the highest concentration of people building interesting stuff tends to be in Ethereum, or like EVM, put it that way. And that's not a judgment on other things. It's just like it's an opinionated point of view. So with that focus on Ethereum, I think you just have a lot of work. Just like how do you get like naturally people who are interested in the EVM to actually be wanting to use something like Farcaster, and that's the exploration and effort we're doing right now.
Hey, can you talk a bit about your resource allocation strategy between building a protocol and a client in parallel?
Yep.
And how you've been thinking about that, how that might have evolved from the early days to now and the future?
80%, 90% on the initial desktop client. That was a mistake. We should have built mobile. Everyone, if you're building a consumer app, you should be building mobile. And I don't care if the App Store is going to be like a hard thing to get through. It's like, that's the hard thing. Like mobile user experience, like it doubled DAO overnight. Like 80% of usage of Farcaster is on mobile. So we started with a desktop app because it was easier. I wish I had just like gone back in time and knocked myself in the head to like go build mobile. We really focused on the app for a year and a half. And that got us to the point where I think in orders of magnitude, you're the first user, figure out some friends, get to 10, And once we got into hundreds of DAO, not any of the fake metrics, then I think we started to actually have enough usage that we had two things. One, we started to have developers be interested, and two, we knew all the problems with the V1 of the system. And so V2 was informed by early developer usage, as well as like just our own experience building our own client on top of the protocol. So that shifted 50-50 to the protocol versus client, and then more recently it's probably been like 60 or 70% protocol. We were really, really pushing a lot of resources in. The other interesting thing is we didn't have any open source contributions for the first 2 years, and now we're up to like 40 individuals total. And so just like now all of a sudden you just have random people who like find the technical problems really interesting. Varun has done an excellent job of finding issues that are just like small things that the team could go do, but he takes the time to spec it out a little bit and then specifically tags it on GitHub issues of like need help, and they're digestible pieces of work. So I think sometimes with open source projects, you know, like everything just is like too big of a chunk of work with a person who doesn't necessarily have enough context. But by taking a little bit of time to like maintain the garden of potential issues, you find people. And we've actually now, someone full-time came in just as a result of, they ran across the repo, they liked how well documented everything was. Remember, zero documentation on the website, but the GitHub was like really, really well organized, and they're full-time hire now, which was really awesome. Hiring is really hard, and like so to have people just like randomly show up off the internet with a PR, and then you like start working with them, and then they become a full-time employee is like pretty cool.
It's cool.
Thank you.
Hey Dan, Murat again from Primev. Can you talk a little bit about the white paper versus build process? Like for our case, you know, there's a white paper for a car that we're kind of working on, but we're also building a skateboard in the meantime, and trying to get a sense of how you allocated resources maybe to those things in the early days, or maybe things that you would do differently knowing your knowledge today.
I think that the exercise of, this is like, to just even broaden it, like the classic, should you write a business plan for your business or like build a product? I think there's a useful intellectual exercise of like, can you think through the system like beforehand of like what you're trying to go build, what that car looks like, and then extract the essence of that to figure out like what is your skateboard from here. And there are always going to be exceptions. There are going to be certain things where it's just like, sorry, like, no, like we're building a car, like we can't have a skateboard first, right? Like obviously Tesla itself, like they built a car, they didn't build a skateboard. But I think in terms of like, what is the core of whatever you're building, and like really, really focus on that and trying to get that in the hands of users, developers, your own product to start, and then kind of work your way there. I think if you think of something like Uniswap, where it's like, and I'm not an expert, but like if you just look at the difference between V1, V2, and V3, like obviously how much more sophisticated V3 is, but like V1 was, Vitalik wrote the white paper. He wrote it in a Reddit post, and then Hayden just like implemented it. So like amazingly successful protocol, but like what the implementation plus like that really just simple website, like that is enough to kind of like start getting those loops kicked off.
Thanks, that helps.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again, Dan.